Just as an introduction to myself, my partner Pearl Colpitz and I, we operated a Silver Fox Ranch from the late 70s into the mid 80s up in Colpitz Settlement. And like many of your forefathers and relatives, our fathers and grandfathers were some of the early men in the industry. I'm a bit of a history buff, and I had the privilege to know some of the early pioneers who twigged my interest in this history. This is a fascinating story of how the Fox business started and how it came to Salisbury. And I have titled my presentation, When Silver Was Gold. Just to start out, Canada owes its very existence to the fur trade. Beaver, which is on our nickel, and I hope they never remove the nickel from circulation, was the backbone of the industry for centuries. Felted beaver hats were not only just fashionable top hats, but were essential to the Army, the Navy, and the cavalry throughout Europe. And they were made from the underfur of the beaver pelt. They were felted, made on forms so that they could be mass produced. And there's an example of some of them. Those aren't all Army hats for sure. They're more of your top hats. But the thing was, they were durable, they were lightweight, they were warm in winter, they were cool in summer, and above all, they were waterproof. And just a little aside, the Mad Hatter in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, he was called the Mad Hatter. Mercury was one of the main elements used to do this process, and it had a devastating effect on the brain and the nervous system, so that's where the Mad Hatter got his name. Now remember that all of Europe, from Russia to Italy to Greece to Spain to England, etc., were ruled by monarchies. But there existed what was known as a sumptuary law, and that restricted luxury and extravagances to only the nobility in order to maintain a social hierarchy. And some of those things were gold, silver, certain pelts, and even certain food of all things. Now, chief among them were the sable, the ermine, and most prized of all was the black fox. In the early 1800s, only 500 black foxes were trapped in the area that's green and yellow and white, United States, Alaska. And that didn't go very far when it came to sharing it with all the nobility in Europe. And hence, it was very, very much in demand. Now, Rupert's Land, as you can see there in green, that was actually the Hudson's Bay Company, and their outpost was at Hay River. And those buildings were where the pelts were stored through the winter and fall, and where the trade goods were stored for the merchandise. In 1869, the Dominion of Canada bought Rupert's Land. We'll just go back. And that would comprise 1/3 of the landmass of the Dominion of Canada, and they paid $1.5 million for it. So the average black fox pelt brought roughly $70 back in the day, and that amounts to around $3,000 today. And many a whiskeyed up, loose-lipped trapper got shot or otherwise murdered just because $3,000 was 10 years' salary back in those days. So now we know why someone would want to try and raise black foxes. So let's answer the question, when did it happen, where did it happen, who did it, and what were the results? So enter Sir Charles Dalton. And he got the Sir, by the way, not from the Queen or the King at the time. He got it from the Pope for his philanthropy. He shared his wealth with the island, built a sanatorium, built many schools. Several of the residences at St. Dunstan's University were he provided. He provided fire trucks, ambulances throughout the island. So he got the Order of St. George, I think it was. Anyway, Olton, who was a native of Tignish, Prince Edward Island, up in the northern, it's the northern part, but actually it's the, it's called up North Point. He bought black foxes whenever he heard about them, and often from the Mi'kmaq. And black foxes were rather endemic on Prince Edward Island, partly because of the small gene pool, because it's only 1 in 1,000 that carry the gene for black fox, but 2 foxes have got to meet up with one another somewhere along the line to bring that out. Anyway, his first experiment was in 1885, and he raised a litter, but the animal stopped breeding. So he called upon a good friend, Robert Olton, for help. Now, Robert Olton was a native of Little Shumagui, New Brunswick, moved to Prince Edward Island to a place called Cherry Island upon the death of his young wife, and he took his 2 sons with him. Now, Cherry Island, that's a picture of it there. Cherry Island is a 211-acre island, and if you know a little bit about Prince Edward Island, if you know where Cavendish is and you know where North Point is, it's a bay halfway between those two, and that's where that island is now called Olton's Island. So he and Dalton were very good friends. They hunted and fished and all kinds of good things together. And in 1890, Dalton moved all of his foxes to Cherry Island. And he and Olton partnered up at that point. And Olton's patience, knowledge of nature, and perseverance brought results. And it's widely accepted, even by the islanders, that if it hadn't been for Olton, there would have been no black fox industry at that time. So production of black foxes began in earnest and would become the foundation stock for foxes throughout the world. Now, around 1900, after the guys had been in it 3 or 4 years, several of their friends kind of had a hint of what was going on, even though Dalton would go in the night with the pelts on a boat and travel over to New Brunswick and have them shipped. They had to be shipped off to England. But he would do it all in secrecy so that nobody'd know what was going on. But anyway, some friends knew what was going on, and they wanted in on the business. Now, the pens that they were building were 50 feet square, and they were made of hex wire. And it's hard to see the wire there, but it's a woven wire, and it has each section has 8 sides to it. I think that's what a hexagon is, isn't it? I go back to my math. Anyway, they were short of funds. Things were going so good, they were short of funds, so they decided that they'd take in some partners. Not just an early, anybody that was in the fox business, that was an early den, by the way. So, they became known as the Big 6 Combine, and there was Dalton and Olton, B.I. and Silas Rayner, Robert Tulpin, and Captain James Gordon. And They had a gentleman's agreement not to sell breeding stock to outsiders in order to control production and the prices soared. The monopoly lasted for a decade, but the year 1910 would change all that. In 1910, Dalton and Olton sold 25 pelts at the Lampsons auction in London. 25 pelts for $36,645, and in today's money, that's $1.15 million. And you gotta know that the average salary of an islander at that time was $300 a year. So, that considerable fortune, C.M. Lampson said in an interview, Dalton wanted us to believe that these animals were trapped, and we thought we'd let him enjoy his little joke, but we made sure, we were sure that they were being raised in captivity. And so after that sale, because it was broadcast all over the world, in every paper you can think of, no amount of secrecy could now hide what was happening. And although the Big Six had maintained its agreement for a decade, that year it was broken when Frank Tulpen, a nephew of Robert Tulpen, sold breeding stock to an outsider. Now this is how that happened. In 1905, we're talking 1910 here, okay? In 1905, Frank pestered, am I speaking into this too much, too loud? Pestered his Uncle Robert and Captain Gordon into selling him a pair of foxes for $1,000, which he borrowed at an interest rate of 6%. In an interview, he said, borrowing by somebody used to dealing in small change for selling eggs at 8 cents a dozen and hogs at 4 cents a pound was a bit of a worry. And that worry was compounded by the fact that the foxes did not produce for the first 3 years. Finally, in 1910, pups were born, and of course he could not get nobody would give him any credit anywhere. He had borrowed other money to the hilt. So hard pressed for cash and with little to show for his effort, Frank sold 2 pairs of live foxes to Harry Holman. Now, any of you who know the island back in the day, the Holman brothers owned the Holman department store in Summerside and another big one in Charlottetown, and they were the stores. You could get everything from dog food, horse food, nails, dresses, you name it. Now, what he got in return, Holman paid him a considerable amount of money, plus he gave him his mansion on Beaver Street in Summerside. And Frank had enough money left over to buy that new Bearcat Stutz. But he was only allowed to drive it on the roads in Summerside because the law on Prince Edward Island said you couldn't drive a car on the roads because it upset the animals. So the wealth of the Big Six was legendary. Now Jim Tulpen inherited the Tulpen foxes of Robert Tulpen upon his uncle's death, or his father's death, I should say. And he was known as the most flamboyant of the early breeders. Anecdotes abound, but one of them was he'd often go into Holman's and he'd buy some little thing like a candy bar and pay it with a big bill and ask to have the money in silver change, which he then threw out to the customers and the sales clerks in the store. And he also was known to go down Main Street on Saturday throwing silver dollars out to the crowd. Now, I want you to remember the name Jim Tulpen. There will be a little quiz at the end here, okay? So in 1910, the gold rush was on and lasted for 4 years. And at this point, oh yes, the massive houses that were built were known as the fox houses, and many of them still exist in Summerside. The industry moved into an extravagant stage. At this point, they started selling breeding stock instead of pelts. And hardly a pelt was going to market. The only foxes going to market were the genuine real culls. Now I also have to tell you, people by this time knew that if you took a red fox, mated it to a silver fox, and then mated those pups back to a black fox, you'd get 50% silvers. So culls could have included reds, crosses, any number of pelts. But the black ones and the best ones were kept for breeding stock. Demand outnumbered the supply, and prices literally soared. Unfortunately, there were more options sold than there were pups born. You could buy a little piece of paper, as they were later called, and you paid 10% down on a future to buy next year's pups. But if next year's pups didn't get produced, you lost your 10% down payment. And yeah, and I'm just going to whip back to Charles Dalton for a minute. Charles Dalton sold out his ranch in 1914, and in that train there are 20 pairs of foxes, and they were being moved to Southport, Prince Edward Island, which is now not Strathcartney, but doesn't matter, just across the harbor from the island. And it was known as the $1 Million Train. And like the Yukon Gold Rush of 1897, news of the fabulous prices for PEI livestock started a stampede of investors from all over the world. And if you couldn't buy a whole fox, you bought part of a fox. Companies sprang up daily in order to raise the necessary capital. So in 1911, that's 1 year after that famous 25 pelts for $36,000, there were 196 companies formed on Prince Edward Island alone, with capital from all over the world. Usually a company was worth either from $300,000 to $1 million. The madness of this wild scramble for equity became apparent when the largest companies probably only had 4 or 5 breeding pairs of foxes. Unbelievable. And this lasted for the next 4 years. In 1911, the price of a pair of fox was $10,000, and by 1914, it was $15,000 a pair. Now, B.I. Rayner received $32,500 for 1 pair, and the highest price ever paid, so that was close to $1 million. Dividends for the company were as high as 400 to 1,000%. And this is cute. A group of Summerside clerks pooled their resources and invested $100. So you can imagine, in a company, we'll say, that capital of $300,000, they were 1 in $300,000, 300 investors, okay? The dividend that following year was $1,000. So this was absolute madness. In 1912, Jim Tulpin sold 22 breeders to a syndicate for $250,000, and that translates to close to $6 million. It's interesting to note that the PEI provincial government budget that year was $400,000. So then and now, you can see why it was called the black fox, because it had very little silvering on it. You'll notice, especially around the face. Look at the face of the fox on the right, all silvered from the back of its ears right down over the butt. And that's today's fox, or yesterday's fox, but this is the fox that we're talking about back in the 1914 and whatever. Size-wise, that little black fox was probably a third the size of the foxes that were pelted a few years ago. Now, where are we? Oh yes, we have World War I coming up. Now remember, World War I was a European war until right to the very end. Now mind you, Canada was in it because it had to go in with the Commonwealth. But the United States didn't go in to the very end, and they made a fortune by supplying armaments and to the war effort in Europe. And the old little story, the rich got rich and the poor got poor, well, that was, although that was written in 1921, it could easily apply to the Roaring Twenties. The employment rate in 1916 in the United States was 100%. Although the war dampened the sale of livestock and pelt sales, it didn't stop it. Prices declined by anywhere from 30 to 50%, depending upon the quality, okay? Now, in 1915, the Fur Trade Review, which would be equivalent to the Fur Trade Vogue magazine of the day, wrote, "The single skin fox scarf saves the day." I have to say that slow because otherwise it's a tongue twister for me. This new vogue for a single fox scarf has caused unusual activity in the fashion world, and the style will have a long run before it reaches its zenith. Does anybody know who that is?
Greta Garbo.
Pardon?
Greta Garbo.
No, that's Queen Elizabeth's mother. And the single fox neck piece, and this goes on to say, is an indispensable adjunct to the summer wardrobe, if you can believe it. Now, this craze would continue throughout the 20s. Now, manufacturers and producers alike wanted to sell more pelts. And so they came up with a new vogue. Now, I've got these two pictures mixed up. The picture on the right should be the first one. That's the Queen Mother again. This time she has two fox pelts slung over her shoulder. And in the one in the middle, no tails and no heads on that one. That's more of a scarf, okay? I was in New York in the early 80s, and I saw, and although Montreal had zillions of pelts, they had storerooms where these pelts were awaiting sale dates, and so you didn't get to see them. You saw mostly the pelts that were going to be sold within the next 2 or 3 weeks. In New York, on the other hand, it was a 7-story building. I was scared to go up. The floors were just so greasy from the fat running out of the pelts. And people were allowed to smoke back then, everywhere. I figured, with my luck, I get to the 3rd floor and the place goes up in flames, you know. Anyway, I saw a buyer who I had come to know in Montreal, and I spoke to him. I said, his name was Frankenfurst or something like that. I spoke to him and I said, "Who's buying all this fur?" And he looked at me over his glasses and he said, "Well, there's 5,000 millionaires on 5th Avenue alone." And do you think any of them would be caught dead in last year's fur? I just sat there with my mouth hanging open, you know. So, during the growth years, in 1920, there were 450 independent ranches other than the companies on Prince Edward Island, and we had 250 in New Brunswick. And I just want to talk to you a second about registration. The Canadian National Livestock Records issues a registration certificate for animals from horses to all kinds of breeds of cattle to sheep, I think even to hens and goats and pigs, don't they, Fred? Yeah. Anyway, certainly when they took the fox breeders on board, they made a fortune. Now, it meant that someone had to come and inspect the animals. You were not allowed to tattoo them for identification. Each fox had 2 ears, or usually did. And in one ear was the ranch letters, and in the other ear was a number and a letter which designated the year the animal was born. And you were not allowed to keep registered and unregistered foxes on the same ranch, or you'd lose your registration status. That's just a little note for what's to come, okay? Oh yeah, expansion. Canada exported 24,000 foxes throughout the world, and most of them went to the United States, and the bigger part of them went to Scandinavia. I got a little note there, $3,500. I have no idea what that means. And now, we also had fox shows. The first was in Boston. Sir Charles Dalton moved to Boston in 1914, and that's where the first live fox show was held. Now the Royal Winter Fair, or the CNE, which I think it later became, or is there 2, Fred? There's 2? Okay. Well, the Royal Agricultural Winter Fair would be where foxes would go, because in the summertime they don't look too good. And fox shows sprang up all over North America. Now just to show you, this is the Canadian National Exhibition at Toronto in 1935 at the CNE, or the Winter Fair. Every trophy there, those aren't silver plated, they're sterling silver. I've seen the second from the left, the middle one, the next one, and the big one that's up on the far left hand. Sorry, the second one from the right, the middle one, the next one, and the one that's on the far side. One of them was presented by the province of New Brunswick. In 1930-something, New Brunswick refused to go to the live fox show up there because all of the judges were islanders. Now, notable events: the Canadian Silver Fox Breeders was established, registration was granted, live fox shows began, Dominion Experimental Farm. I don't know if any of you can remember that, but when I was a kid on the island, my father never drove through Summerside that he didn't take me up and show me where the experimental farm was. Marketing branch, livestock inspection, Now, the Great Depression, we have no idea just how terrible that was, and that was followed by the Dust Bowl, and that affected the United States most. But in an article in I don't know whether it was the St. John paper or the Moncton paper, it said, "No depression here." The stock market had crashed. The U.S. was hardest hit. But during that time, ancillary services were started up, and large numbers of employees were needed to man the raw feed companies There were 5 biscuit factories in Moncton alone, equipment providers, wire providers, pharmaceuticals, trade journals, employees, salesmen, office workers, you name it. Now, where am I? And on the farm, the largest number of employees were needed in the fall and winter months because that was the pelting and breeding season. So that helped considerably with seasonal unemployment. In 1939, 250,000 pelts were sent to market in Canada, while the world production was 1 million. Now, I guess we can just sort of skip through that. Salisbury. If I told you that in 1890, which is 204 years ago, in 1820, that Salisbury was as big as Moncton, would you believe it? It was important. Salisbury was an important spot. It was a busy, thriving community. Now, I still call it the Post Road, the road from Moncton, from Halifax to Moncton, to Petitcodiac to St. John. To me, that's the Post Road. You can call it Main Street or whatever you want. That carried the mail. And it was located on the Petitcodiac River at the first crossing from Westmoreland County. And it was the junction of the Fredericton Road, because that was where the capital was even back in those days. And it was a railroad terminal from 1860. Now, I've got written on there 3 hotels sprang up. Actually, I saw an old graphic, whatever. There were 5 hotels in Salisbury at the time. Now, what's my next slide? Oh, yeah. And the railroad station is where we began. Now, who did I tell you to remember? Jim Talpin. Well, and we know that Jim Talpin had taken over his uncle's ranch at Black Banks and was they had gone from rags to riches. Anyway, in 1912, Jim's mother was on a clothes shopping spree to Montreal, no less. None of this Holman stuff anymore. She took the wrong train in Moncton. Instead of taking the train going north up to Campbellton and on to Montreal, she took the one going to St. John, ended up in Salisbury. Now, the station master at the time was called Ardmore Brown. And for those of you who know Merle McRae, that would have been his grandfather. Anyway, Mrs. Talpin regaled Ardmore with the stories of how fabulous a wealth you could have if you got into foxes. And of course, she was promoting her son's ranch at Black Banks. Anyway, Brown went to Black Banks, and Talpin's foxes were by this time known for their clarity and their sharpness of black color. And on his return, he convinced Albert Trites and Victor Gowland to partner with him, and they purchased a pair, they purchased a pair of foxes. And we're assuming that they paid around $15,000 for them. The pair produced a litter of 4. 1 female and 3 males. But they didn't have any problem selling the 3 males, and they refused to sell the pup female, even though they were offered $10,000 for her. Now, there is a rumor that it was Fred Colbitch that offered the $10,000, but we have no proof of that. But I know that Fred, at the time, was raising money in a company to buy foxes, and he very well could have been the person. Anyway, the pup up and died. Brown buried her at the base of a tree. And with the following epitaph. Oh, pause from a stranger, shed a tear, $10,000 is buried here. Boyd Price tells me that when they were kids, that sign was still up, and they all used to go digging around that tree to see if they couldn't find the 10,000. Now, enter Fred Colpitts. He only went by the name Fred. He was that famous in the industry that they just said Fred. They didn't even bother to use his last name. Funny thing, Lee Colpitts one time, as a young man, they always went to the fur sales to protect the pelts. Now, by protecting the pelts, in those days you were allowed to buy them back rather than let them go at a poor price, and you also wanted to see what the sale was going like. He picked up a cab at the railroad station and said that he wanted to go to Lampson's fur sales, and the cab driver turned around and he said, "Are you from New York or Salisbury?" Anyway, Fred was born at Little River in 1887 and he died in 1963. At the age of 25, Fred was able to convince neighbors to invest into a company and buy foxes. In 1914, 3 foxes were purchased on PEI for $15,000. 2 of them were male, 1 female, and it was possibly from Holman himself. And he and Evan Hopper, and Evan was an old man when I was young, and I've heard him tell the story of he and Fred damn near freezing to death in the boxcar with these 3 foxes and a rifle loaded with them.
Yes, sir.
Fred was very successful raising foxes and expanded his operation in 1921 to Alberta with his brother James at a ranch in Springbank just outside of Calgary. Now, prior to this, they were bringing horses and rabbits. Now, they weren't rabbits as we know them, they were jackrabbits. And they were just absolutely devastating the prairie, eating everything in sight. And there was a bounty on their head. And rabbits were brought here to Salisbury by the hundreds of thousands to feed the foxes. It was one of their favorite foods, by the way. The horses came live. And I remember Pearl saying, "Oh God, we hated it when a trainload of horses came in. We had to leave school, all of us, meeting the cousins, Lee's family, Grant, Roger, Pearl, didn't matter, and herd these foxes from the train station up here at Salisbury, right past the high school, on their way to Colpitts Settlement." Pearl said those were the most embarrassing days of my life. But building the fox ranch in Calgary, that's, instead of taking the meat to the foxes, they took the foxes to the meat. And it also offered them an opportunity to sell breeding stock, attend live fox shows to promote Colpitts Brothers foxes. Now, Colpitts Brothers, meaning the 2 farms here and in Calgary, were the largest fox farming enterprises in the British Empire. Now, Fromm Brothers in Wisconsin had their largest ranch in the world, and the largest single ranch within a single confine was W.K. Rogers and Raoul Raymond ranch near Charlottetown. Now, Raoul Raymond, just as a little bit of an aside, he was the owner-operator of Dalvey by the Sea. So Fred would become the member of the legislature, and he would go on to become a member of the Atlantic Agricultural Hall of Fame. Now that's a picture. How do I make this thing go? How do I make the little red thing go? Oh, this was called the Upper Ranch. This was called Howard's Ranch. And there was a ranch down here. It was usually referred to as the Curtis Ranch. And they all had roughly 400 breeding females. Now, mutations were popping up all the time. But if you wanted to keep your registration, you could not let the inspectors see these foxes. They only wanted silver foxes. So most people did away with them. Not Fred. He was a man of his own conviction. He kept them. But he kept them well hidden. He had lots of places to hide them on, right? So, Fred said himself in a Maclean's magazine interview that he traveled over 100,000 miles, bought a new car every spring, and set out across Canada and United States looking for, he referred to them as the freaks. And somewhere, okay. The men back home in Colbitz awaited a call from the station master on a regular basis to come pick up a crate of live foxes, which the employees knew had to go out back and be hidden somewhere away from any inspectors. Now, the inspectors were usually only there in the spring, but they did tend to make spot checks now and then. In the late 20s, oddities started showing up, and the first was the pearl. And the pearl was really just, I've got pearl platinum on there, but really it should be pearl. It was just a gunmetal gray fox, very pretty. I never did see one with enough fur to flag a wheelbarrow, but anyway, some of them, some people did manage to raise good pearls. And then the white marked silver. They could have a white blaze, they could have white around their collar, they could have a white marking in their chest. And then the platinums came along, and then the white-faced platinum. And that picture that we saw a while back of Fred, oh well, no, I can go ahead, I don't have to do that. So he bought a new car, They were secreted away. And in 1930, a very strange metallic gray pup was born at the Calgary Ranch, and Fred personally brought this animal home. And this is a comment from Maclean's magazine. Fred got platinum from silver and gold from them both. Now, oops, I'm just a little bit ahead of myself. Here we go back. I think I know this thing so well that I can. The very first white-faced platinums were offered for sale in Norway in 1937. One pelt was sold to the Duchess of Kent, and the Duchess of Kent was who? King Edward VIII's wife, whom I abdicated for, right? This was written up in the Times and Transcript. One of Fred's employees read it and said, "Jeepers," she says, "Fred's got hundreds of them hidden out back of the ranch." Fred later said, "Norway gave me free advertising and the rest is history." Overnight, the white-faced platinums were the talk of the town. and the market loved them, and the race was on for breeding stock. And by 1946, Fred had sold over 1,000 pelts, not to mention the hundreds of foxes that he sold as breeding stock. Now, it is 7:45. I said I'd have you out of here by 8:30. That's the platinum class of 1940 at the New Brunswick show, and every fox on the table is a Colbit's fox, by the way. That's Pearl's father, that's Curtis Davis. Anybody know who that is? I'm not quite sure. I know I should know. That's Sanford Colbit's, that's Ott Hopper, that's Fred Colbit's. I'm coming down the side, John. Anyway, next. Out here in the ranch, this was a calendar in 1939, and I've forgotten whether it was Massey Ferguson or Massey Harris, but that was the picture on the calendar. And we can name every person that's there except the except the gentleman right here. He's well hidden. Does anybody want me to go through those names by any chance? It doesn't take long. I will. The first person on the left, Charlie McCormick, Bill Gilderd, unknown, Sanford Colbit's, Guy Miller, and that's Oliver Colbit's, Cecil Colbit's, and Howard Colbit's. Isabel, there's your father. And then Lee Colbit's, Roy Hopper. We got a Hopper here in the crowd tonight, don't we? Yes. That would have been your grandfather, right?
My dad.
Pardon?
That's my dad.
Your dad?
Yeah.
Really? Good, good. Curtis Davis, Blair Lehman. This gentleman in here is Lorne Colbit's, Manning Doothright. Russell Colbit's is there. Fred Colbit's is there. And Walter Bannister. And in the front row, we have Edson Davis, Allison Taylor, Bill Murray. Bill, your son, Bill's son's here. Grandfather, I mean. Lee Colbit's, Lawrence Colbit's, Lucy, and Holly Gilderd, and Jean. Jean and Lucy were Fred's daughters. So there's a lot of history there, and it's nice to have some of the people whose parents are there. And when Pearl and I started out, we were told, this is not a business for girls. And that was sort of a red flag, just like you'd put in front of a bull. Anyway, we got smart. We hired, what am I doing? What happened? There. We hired Sanford Colbit's, Curtis Davis, and where's Bill? Is that Bill down there?
Yep.
So if you're gonna start out good, you need to get good employees, and we lucked in. We bought 20 females. If you were lucky, you could get an average of 3, and that's what you gunned for all the time. Didn't make it on some years, maybe snuck over the line in others. Our first year, our average was 5.75. So we got in the business big time. Where am I? Now, oh yes, here's a picture. And Truman Kopp, we have a relative here. Russell Colbit's. We're not sure who this man is. That's Ora Ailes. My grandfather, Clarence Colbit's, Oliver Colbit's, and that's Cy Sherwood. He was the, Cy Sherwood was the member for the Norton area. Sam Colbit's, Ott Hopper, Lawrence Colpitts, Lee Colpitts, my father, don't know who that man is, John Colpitts, and don't know these two. And if anybody knows who they are, speak up. Anyway, we're getting close to the end. So, by the way, the royal family very seldom paid for their own furs. They were donated to people like the gifts of the Canadian Silver Fox Breeders Association. This was in an attempt to try to promote fox again, but by this time it was dead. All right, there's the arch. Now, oh damn, I forgot to bring the herd book. The herd book is a book about this big, and depending on the year, anywhere from this thick to 2 volumes per year. And I got all the names from the 1930 herd book. Okay, now here's my stupid picture of Salisbury. This is Fredericton Road. This is the Post Road, Main Street. This is River Road. There's the railroad station, okay? Where did I get myself another little piece of paper here? So, the first ranch we know was the R.A. Trites Gowland Ranch, and it was built right across from the train station. And anybody that's been in the business, we all think we have to hide them off in the woods somewhere and keep them away from any traffic or noise. But I guess if the trains were on a regular schedule, the foxes can get used to it regular. I don't hear the trains go by anymore at night, and I guess maybe the foxes didn't either, but they were a little closer to them than I am. So that was the Brown Ranch. The next was the Temple Blenis Ranch up the hill, up on the Fredericton Road. The next one I'm showing is the A.E. Trites at the Dayton Farm. And then Archie Nielsen, and I'm sure there's some of you here today that know of Archie. And Weldon Steeves, and Victor Gowland. And Victor Gowland lived in what most people think of as the Settle House on the corner of Main Street and the Fredericton Road, but it was originally the Gowland House. Now, Nelson Allward, who owned an insurance company. Harrison Tate, I don't see any of the Tate family here tonight, is there any? That's where Cree lives. A Murphy, we weren't able to find out what that Murphy's real name was, it just said Murphy and Son. And then Tommy Hamilton, Arthur Wilmot, Clint Russell. Clint Russell's ranch was just across the railroad track at the top of Peter Street. Sam Lisson, down here in the Post Road. Cliff Sentle, Sterling Trites, John Eagles. Now that was the largest ranch. That had 250 or so breeding females. Henry McDonald, down here on McDonald Road. Bev Taylor, in behind this little shop. Now, guess what was right where the village office is now? Fred Colpitts had a ranch there. Fred and Alden. William Chapman across the street, and that's where the dog food or whatever company is. And Lee Colpitts across the river. Pete and Arnold Blakeney up here on the river. Pete, Ty Price, Garfield Campbell, way up there on Main Street. Eldon Price, I don't know where Eldon is, anyway. Mick Williams, Mitten down here on the left. Miles Workman, Mick Williams, who was also the principal of the high school, and basically it was 2 to 3 pairs up to 250 pairs. Now, it's no empty boast that Maclean's magazine wrote in 1939. You can see more foxes within a 25-mile radius of Salisbury than anywhere else in the world. And World War I brought an end. That was the death knell. Europe, economies were ruined, factories were destroyed, and people were tired of the clothing restrictions, and they had just gone through 6 years of hell. And people tired of the clothes restrictions, prices plummeted, horse meat was going for human consumption, labor costs tripled, and do you see any fox fur there? I don't. That was the new style, the new vogue at the time. One evening, I went to see Jan16. He was a great old guy, if you could get on the right side of him, and I worked hard to do that, I'll tell you. Anyway, I went one evening, and I said, Archie, why do you think the fox industry went out of style? And he said, he was Scottish, and he never lost his Scottish accent, even though he'd been here since he was a young boy. When the working girl could afford to buy a fox fur coat, then the rich no longer wanted it. Simple as that. So, lasting impact. And I didn't go into this most recent whatever. It's how the fox industry came into being. And the lasting impact was it brought great wealth, additional income, and great wealth to many. Unemployment, especially during the Depression years and into the late 30s, in this area did not have a great impact. Agriculture diversification. Fred was one of the first to diversify. He did hogs, but his prize Holstein cattle was another diversification that Fred did. And I'm using Fred as example. Many others did the same, knowing that the fox industry wasn't going to last forever and they had to find something else. And it was a chance for families, could afford to sell family members into a new business. And of all the things that I think is the most important of all, I think we've heard the old adage, the Maritime's greatest export was education, is education. And the new wealth, or simply the supplement to the income when a pair of foxes could allowed families to educate their children, and in this respect has been greatly undervalued. I was walking by the doctor's room. Pearl and I had an article put in the Riverview Recorder, and Dr. Edgett came out the door and he hollered, Connie, get in here. We were just talking about you girls. We were girls back then. And I went in the doctor's room, and I remember there was Dr. Wright, Dr. Rich, Dr. Wright, Dr. White, Dr. Rich, Dr. McClellan, Dr. McCrae, Dr. Dobson, Dr. Edgett, Dr. Rubin. They were all somehow associated with the fox business, and their comment was, we were just here discussing the fact that if our parents had not had foxes in the backyard, we would have never been able to afford to go to university. And I think that, to me is one of the greatest impacts of the industry is education. Because education begets education as time goes on. And although the grandeur of this era has left behind only scattered evidence of its existence, this once great enterprise had a very profound and lasting effect on this area and the world. And I think that this tower that's over on the Beckwith property now but belonged to Lee Colquitt's. I've been in that tower many a time. That's where we were peeping toms watching the foxes mate. And I thank you for coming. Anybody that wants to leave because of the storm is more than welcome to do so, but I would entertain a question and answer if anybody has that. Anybody have a question?
Connie, was the towers meant for what purpose?
Spying on foxes being mated.
Just the mating thing?
That, and usually the first floor was designed to hold fox feed. The second floor was usually where hired men lived, and the third floor was for the peeping toms. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I was curious about your numbers of like black foxes being produced like from the wild. Like, I have no connection to the fox industry as such, but I've been a lifelong tracker. And I know parts of Canada have a lot of, we like to call them colored foxes, whether they were crosses or wild silvers. And like Anticosti Island, probably 60% of the foxes on Anticosti Island are colored. And Newfoundland has a lot of colored foxes.
And that's because of the small gene pool.
Mm-hmm.
And if there happens to be, you know, a fox carrying a mutation gene, that's going to get spread all through the gene pool. And the same happened on Prince Edward Island. And you'll get blacks, you'll get crosses, you'll get, help me out here.
Bastards.
Yeah, bastard silvers. And we got a couple of pearls pop up in our ranch, but the only ones of interest were, we called them the Holsteins. They had one blue eye, and one half of their face was white, and the inside of the ear was black, and on the other side, the inside of the ear was white, and the face was black. And they also had patches, white patches on them. And we got a good price for them, but they went to Norway. We couldn't be bothered, we couldn't be bothered trying to experiment. Our ranch was too small. You had to have a big ranch to try to do an experiment like that.
Would you get Samsons on
Oh,
a ranch?
yes. We only got one Samson in our ranching years, but they used to show up quite frequently. I know Pearl speaks of them and said that when they were kids, they called them chummies because they were small and all they seemed to have was underfur and not very much silvering at all. And they were allowed to pelt those and send them off to market and get the 15 cents for them, you know. But they were chummies to them, and they were tame. They were stupid, very stupid. So I don't know what. And when I spoke of the mutations that were on that slide, I didn't mention that later on, blondes and beiges and browns and so on also popped up, but that was in later years.
How long did you ranch, and are they still ranching here in Salisbury?
There's nobody ranching anymore. I think there's one guy that still has a couple of pets, but other than that, we ranched for 10 years up at Little River. In fact, it was almost 11 years. Yeah.
There's a guy on the other side of Sussex still has a ranch.
Pardon?
There's a guy on the other side of Sussex, Perleyville still has a ranch.
What's his name?
Kevin Raymond.
Oh, Kevin, yes, for sure. Kevin, I forgot about him.
Doesn't Ron Steve still do something?
Well, all he's got left is a few pets that he can't bring himself to pelt.
Is that on the back road?
Yes, yeah. Any other, yes?
You spoke last time you had this about Sanford, something he did to
Oh.
help develop the.
Anybody that wants, this will take me 5 minutes to describe this, but anybody that wants to leave is welcome. When the white mark silver first came on, you know, the one that the Duchess of Kent was wearing and so on, Fred declared to his employees, I want the best of the white mark, made it to the best of the white mark, and I'm gonna get the best of the white mark. Anyway, he claimed that his foxes bred true genetically. Anyway, a Dr. Shackelford came from Wisconsin up to visit this Fred's ranch, and Fred brought him up to the tower where Sanford was, and Fred said, this is Mr. Sanford Colpitts. He'll tell you everything you need to know. He's my right-hand man. I'm busy, I'm leaving. And out he went. So Shackelford sat down and talked about his interest, and also at the same time, white mark silvers were showing up, white, you know, different, all kinds of mutations were showing up, mostly in the platinum and the white marks and so on. And he said, Mr. Colpitts, you say that, Mr. Colpitts says that these breed true. And Sanford, if you knew him, was a man of very few words. And he just kept shaking his head like this. And then finally Mr. Shackelford said to him, but when you mate a white mark silver with a white mark platinum silver, there is a lethal gene there, and there should be dead white pups. Sanford, yeah. Anyway, so he said, Shackelford said, but I'm surprised your ranch average is so high. If you are losing these white pups because of the white lethal affair, why is your ranch average so high? Sanford reaches down on the counter and brings up another set of books, and he says, these are my books. The ones underneath there for Fred. So this was written up the research center at Wisconsin wrote up their results of their whatever every year, and that was written up. So I don't know. Fred and Sanford were good friends all their life. So I guess it didn't ruin a friendship. And one day, early on, we got a thing that said that there was going to be this big fur exhibition in Wisconsin, and that Dr. Shackelford was going to be there. And Pearl nothing would do, she was going to go. So she and Ty jumped on a plane and off they went. So Mr. Shackelford was about to speak, and there had been a list of all the participants and where they were from and whether they were fox farmers or mink farmers and so on and so forth. And he said, is there a Miss Pearl Colpitts in the crowd? And she raised her hand, and he said, I want to talk to you afterwards. And then he related the story, and and he said, Mr. Colpitts didn't have too much to say, but he had the proof of what he was doing and how he got a good ranch average. Any other questions?
Not a question, but speaking about the former presentation that you did that they just referred to, I want you to talk about how these gentlemen were working with DNA and genetics before DNA and genetics were really ever a thing, and I thought that was fascinating. And you talked in their last one about the Arctic fox.
Yes. There was a fox called, the Arctic fox is a completely different fox, and it was only Norway that was able to somehow cross the Arctic fox. The Arctic fox has not so much guard hair, but massive amount of long underfur. And those little guys can sleep out in 50-degree minus temperatures with a wind chill of 150, you know, and just curl up and be as cozy as can be. Norway were the only people that I know that absolutely managed to cross the pearls with that. But there was an Alaskan fox, and the Alaskan fox looked like a silver fox, except it had brown rusted tufts in its ears. And when Pearl and I came to the business, Sanford and Curtis, listen, we got to get a hold of an Alaskan fox, you know, we got to get a hold of an Alaskan fox. And we said, why? When you mated an Alaskan fox with a silver fox, you got 100% crosses. And that was worth a fortune, because ordinarily if you made an ordinary cross with a silver and whatever, you get a hodgepodge, you know, you get bastards, as this gentleman called them up there, and I do too. Crosses, semi-crosses, silvers, usually poor silvers. Anyway, we worked for years trying to find trappers in the north and so on, but never did find an Alaskan fox. But these men were smart enough, people like Sanford and Howard, they were dedicated. I mean, they were loyal employees of Fred's. They were dedicated to getting good production, getting good foxes, results, you know, through mating programs and so on. And they were very observant of what they saw. And they knew something was happening, and they knew how to do. They were the ones that managed to figure out how to get the glaciers and the perlatinas, and that picture of Queen Elizabeth, those were glacier perlatina foxes, almost white in color around her neck, with a blue cast to them. Is that what you meant?
That's what I meant, just that it would be highlighted and recorded for.
Yeah. They, and their record-keeping system. Sanford said to us one day, he kept a book of records, okay? And he put them in his pocket at night, and he took them with him. And we used to take his book and copy down a copy. But we left our copy up at the ranch. Except during mating time, or when it came time to tattoo, then we took this book and we did something else with it. Anyway, Sanford said, "Where's your records?" And we said, "Right there." "Do you have another set?" "No." "Well, you have a set." "Yeah." "Do you have another set?" "No." "Why don't you have another set?" "Well, because you've got a set." Anyway, all that was because, remember I pointed in the picture, the ranch on the hill that was Sanford's? That burned down, and with it, the records. And after that, we didn't have 2 sets of records. Pearl was a great record person, and she had about 4 sets of records after that. She kept one in the truck, one at the ranch, one at home, one in a safe, for God's sake. Because if you lost that information, we knew a lot of the foxes by their looks, you know. We knew, if we would read the year of the fox, we knew who its parents were, because we had a small ranch. But if you know, the most foxes we ever had was probably 300 mating pairs, because I remember that the biggest number of pups we ever had was 1,400 or 1,040 some pups. So That's how I guess I know that it was 300 breeding females. I don't know where I was going with this. That is not important. Pardon?
Record keeping, you were talking.
Yeah, records. Pearl is a great record keeper for sure. And she informed me a couple of years back that if anything happens to me, says she, I do not want those records destroyed. And I felt like saying, you know, where do you want me to keep them? But anyway, there's no Hall of Fame for foxes in New Brunswick. There's nowhere you can take this. Although I have understood that the museum will take some things. So whether they'll take Pearl's records or not, it's another matter.